The glass facade of First Trust Bank gleamed in the bright morning sun, reflecting the lively hustle of the city's main street. Cars honked as commuters hurried to work, and pedestrians bustled along the sidewalks. Inside the bank, the atmosphere was equally busy. The rhythmic tapping of keyboards, the occasional hum of a printer, and the murmur of polite customer interactions filled the air. David Harper, the senior manager, stood near the teller counters, his sharp gaze sweeping the room. He wore a crisp gray suit, his tie perfectly knotted, and his polished leather shoes gleamed under the fluorescent lights. David prided himself on his professionalism. To him, appearance and precision were everything, and he expected the same from his team. "Let's stay sharp today, everyone," he said, his voice firm as he addressed his staff during the morning briefing. "Customers expect excellence, and that's exactly what we'll deliver." David was known for his rigid adherence to rules. While his dedication was admirable, some employees quietly found him intimidating, even cold. He had little patience for mistakes, and often let his perfectionism cloud his judgment. As the clock struck 9 a.m., the bank doors opened, and the day's first customers began to trickle in. David stood by the main desk, observing each person as they entered. He assessed them with a practiced eye, noting their attire, demeanor, and purpose. In his mind, each customer fit into a category: high priority, average, or potential risk. Midway through the morning rush, a middle-aged black woman entered the bank. She wore a tailored navy blue suit and carried a sleek leather handbag. Her stride was confident, but unhurried, and her expression was composed, almost serene. She exuded a quiet authority that turned a few heads, though she seemed oblivious to the attention. Her name was Martha Ellis, though none of the employees recognized her. Not yet. Martha's steps were measured as she approached the reception desk, her gaze briefly scanning the layout of the bank. To her, this wasn't just a financial institution. It was part of an empire she had built with her own two hands. The receptionist, a young teller named Claire, greeted her with a polite smile. "Good morning, ma'am. How can I assist you today?" Martha returned the smile, sliding a check across the counter. "Good morning. I'd like to deposit this, please." Claire picked up the check and glanced at it. Her eyes widened slightly at the amount: $250,000. It wasn't the largest sum the bank had ever processed, but it was significant enough to require managerial approval. "One moment, ma'am," Claire said, her tone respectful. "I'll need to get my manager's authorization." David, who had been standing a few feet away, noticed Claire's hesitation and stepped forward. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his voice clipped, but controlled. Claire quickly explained the situation, handing him the check. David examined it, his brow furrowing as he read the details. Ellis Enterprises, LLC, a company name he didn't recognize. David's eyes shifted to Martha, assessing her attire and demeanor. While she was impeccably dressed, something about her made him pause. He couldn't place it, but his instincts told him to proceed with caution. "Do you have identification?" he asked, holding the check but not yet processing it. Martha nodded and handed him her driver's license. It listed her as Martha Ellis, CEO of Ellis Enterprises. David barely glanced at it before looking back at the check. "This is a significant amount," he said, his tone measured. "Do you have documentation proving your connection to this business? A corporate account requires verification." Martha raised an eyebrow. "The account is under my name, as is the business. My ID in this check should suffice." David hesitated, his grip on the check tightening. Something about this situation felt off to him, though he couldn't articulate why. "Ma'am, we have strict protocols for deposits of this size. Without proper documentation, I'm afraid I can't authorize this transaction." Martha's expression didn't change, but her eyes sharpened. "I've deposited checks of this size here before without issue. Why is it a problem now?" David straightened, his demeanor becoming more formal. "It's standard procedure, ma'am. If you can return with the necessary paperwork, we'd be happy to assist you." The room had grown quieter. Other customers and employees subtly watched the exchange, sensing the underlying tension. Martha held David's gaze for a long moment, her calm exterior unwavering. "Is this how you treat all your customers?" she asked quietly. "Or just the ones who look like me?" David stiffened. "I assure you, ma'am, my decision is based solely on protocol." Martha gave a faint smile, polite yet distant. "I see. Thank you for your time." She took back her check and ID, then turned and walked out of the bank, her steps as composed as when she had entered. As the door closed behind Martha, the tension in the room lingered. Employees exchanged uneasy glances, and a few customers muttered to each other. Claire, the young teller, looked particularly uncomfortable. "Mr. Harper?" she said hesitantly. "Was that really necessary?" Her ID matched the account, and David cut her off. "Claire, it's not our job to make assumptions. Protocol exists for a reason. If she's legitimate, she'll return with the proper documents." Claire bit her lip, unsure how to respond. She returned to her station, her mind replaying the exchange. To her, Martha had seemed credible, professional, and polite. So, why had David been so dismissive? The next morning, the atmosphere at First Trust Bank was charged with anticipation. David arrived early, as usual, ready to tackle the day's tasks. He was reviewing reports when he noticed an unusual commotion near the entrance. A group of well-dressed executives had entered the bank, their polished shoes clicking against the marble floor. At the center of the group was a familiar figure, Martha Ellis. David's stomach dropped. His mind raced as he tried to process the situation. Why was she here? And who were these people with her? The answer came moments later when Tom Phillips, the regional director of Ellis Financial Holdings, approached him. "David," Phillips said, his tone brisk, "I'd like you to meet Martha Ellis. She's the owner of Ellis Financial Holdings, the parent company of this bank." David's face turned ashen. He turned to Martha, who regarded him with the same composed expression she had worn the day before. "Ms. Ellis," he stammered. I didn't realize." "That much was clear," Martha interrupted smoothly. "Yesterday, you refused to process my check despite having all the necessary documentation. I'd like to understand why." David opened his mouth, but no words came out. His colleagues watched the exchange in stunned silence. "I've reviewed your protocols," Martha continued, her voice calm but firm, "and I've spoken to the regional team. There was no valid reason for my check to be denied." Phillips crossed his arms, his expression unreadable. "This is unacceptable, David. We pride ourselves on treating every customer with fairness and respect." David's attempt at an explanation faltered. I was just following protocol." "Protocol," Martha said sharply, "is not an excuse for poor judgment. Your actions reflected poorly on this institution and the values it stands for." The air in the bank's lobby grew thick with tension. Every employee, customer, and even the security guard by the door seemed frozen in place, their eyes fixed on the unfolding confrontation. David's usually confident demeanor had crumbled, leaving him visibly shaken. His mind raced for an explanation, an excuse, something to salvage his reputation in the eyes of both his colleagues and the powerful woman standing before him. Martha Ellis, however, remained perfectly composed. Her poised figure and calm expression belied the sharp edge in her voice. Yesterday's incident was more than just a misunderstanding, she began, her voice resonating throughout the room. It was a clear failure of this bank's principles I worked hard to establish. David swallowed hard, his palms beginning to sweat. Ms. Ellis, he started, his voice unsteady, I can assure you my intentions were purely professional. I was simply adhering to protocol, Martha interrupted, raising an eyebrow. Or to your assumptions? David's mouth opened, but no words came out. Martha turned to the assembled staff, her gaze sweeping over them like a wave. Let's be very clear about something. Every customer who walks through those doors deserves to be treated with dignity and respect, regardless of how they look, what they wear, or the size of their transaction. That is the foundation of this institution, and any deviation from that standard is unacceptable. The room remained silent, the weight of her words settling over everyone present. Martha's tone softened slightly as she continued. I built Ellis Financial Holdings on the belief that fairness and integrity must guide every decision, no matter how small. Yesterday's encounter demonstrated a lapse in those values, and it's my responsibility to ensure it doesn't happen again. Martha gestured toward the bank's conference room. Mr. Harper, let's continue this conversation privately. Mr. Phillips, please join us. David nodded stiffly, his legs feeling like lead as he followed Martha and Phillips into the glass-walled room. As the door closed behind them, the muffled hum of the lobby faded, replaced by an oppressive silence. Martha took a seat at the head of the table, folding her hands neatly in front of her. David and Phillips sat opposite her, the tension in the room palpable. I'd like to hear your perspective, Mr. Harper, Martha said, her tone measured. Why did you feel it necessary to deny my transaction yesterday? David hesitated, his mind scrambling for the right words. Ms. Ellis, I want to emphasize that my decision was not personal, he began, carefully choosing his phrasing. The amount was substantial, and I felt it was my duty to ensure everything was in order. I simply requested additional documentation to verify. To verify what? Martha interrupted, her eyes narrowing. My identity? My authority over an account in my own name? David flushed. It's standard procedure to request. Standard procedure, Martha repeated, her voice now tinged with steel. Did you ask yourself why you felt I required more scrutiny than other customers? Or was it easier to rely on assumptions? David's gaze dropped to the table. He wanted to defend himself, to argue that his actions were justified, but deep down, he knew she was right. He had made a snap judgment based on her appearance, and now he was paying the price. Martha leaned back in her chair, her expression softening ever so slightly. Mr. Harper, I'm not here to humiliate you, but I do need you to understand the implications of your actions. Your behavior yesterday didn't just inconvenience me. It undermined the trust and reputation this bank has worked hard to build. Phillips, who had been silent until now, nodded in agreement. David, this isn't just about one incident. It's about the culture we create here. If customers feel judged or unwelcome, they won't come back, and that affects everyone. David looked up, his face etched with regret. I understand, Ms. Ellis. I made a mistake, and I'm truly sorry. Martha studied him for a moment, her gaze thoughtful. Apologies are a start, but they're not enough. Accountability and growth are what matter most. She turned to Phillips. I want to implement mandatory bias training for all staff, starting immediately. And I'd like Mr. Harper to lead the charge. David's eyes widened in surprise. Me? Yes, you. Martha said firmly. You have the opportunity to turn this experience into something meaningful. Lead by example. Show your colleagues and our customers that we're committed to fairness and equity. Over the following weeks, the atmosphere at First Trust Bank began to shift. Martha's directives were put into action, with workshops and training sessions designed to address implicit bias and foster a more inclusive environment. The sessions were eye-opening for many employees, including David, who began to reflect deeply on his own assumptions and behaviors. Martha made regular visits to the branch, not as a figure of authority, but as a mentor and guide. She held open forums where employees could share their experiences and concerns, creating a space for honest dialogue. Her presence was both inspiring and humbling, a reminder of the values the bank was built upon. David, once rigid and aloof, gradually transformed into a more empathetic and approachable leader. He took his new responsibilities seriously, working closely with his team to ensure that every customer interaction upheld the principles Martha had emphasized. Months later, Martha returned to the branch for an unannounced visit. This time, she arrived not as a customer, but as an observer, quietly watching the staff interact with customers. She noted the warmth in their greetings, the attentiveness in their service, and the genuine smiles that now graced their faces. As she approached the main desk, David stepped forward to greet her. His demeanor was calm and confident, but there was a noticeable humility in his eyes. "Good morning, Ms. Ellis," he said, extending his hand. "It's a pleasure to see you again." Martha shook his hand, her expression one of quiet approval. "Good morning, Mr. Harper. How are things?" "Better," David replied honestly. "Thanks to your guidance and the lessons I've learned." Martha nodded. "I'm glad to hear that. Remember, leadership isn't about being perfect. It's about being willing to grow and inspire others to do the same." David smiled, a genuine warmth in his expression. "Thank you, Ms. Ellis. I won't forget that." The story of Martha Ellis and her confrontation with David Harper became something of a legend within Ellis Financial Holdings. It wasn't just a tale of a manager learning a lesson. It was a reminder of the power of accountability, the importance of equity, and the transformative impact of true leadership. For Martha, it was a testament to the values she had built her empire upon. For David, it was a turning point that reshaped not only his career, but also his perspective on life. And for the customers of First Trust Bank, it was a promise that fairness and respect would always come first.